So if you would like to purchase a copy to be signed, they can help you with that. If you brought your own, you're welcome to use that also and have Edward sign at the end of our program. Be sure to help yourself to refreshments. There are cookies, water, and tea along this wall over here. Help yourself. And just in case you need restrooms, head straight out these doors and then go, when you see the aisle to the first aisle to your left, that will take you to where you need to be. So Edward Kelsey Moore is the author of the New York Times and international best-selling novel, The Supremes at Earl's All You Can Eat, and the second Supremes novel, The Supremes Sing the Happy Heartache Blues. The Supremes at Earl's All You Can Eat was chosen as a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer selection and was also named an Illinois Reads book by the Illinois Reading Council. Edward was awarded the first novelist award by the Black Caucus of the American Library Association and received an Illinois Arts Council Award. A film adaptation of The Supremes at Earl's All You Can Eat was released by Searchlight Pictures in 2024. This film is currently available for viewing on Hulu. Edward's essays and short fiction have appeared in the New York Times and a number of literary magazines, including Inkwell, African American Review, Ninth Letter, and Indiana Review. His work has also appeared on Chicago Public Radio and Minnesota Public Radio. In addition to writing and storytelling, that sounds exhausting already, Edward maintains a career as a professional cellist. His playing has been featured on multiple classical, pop, and jazz recordings, and he has toured nationally and internationally. For many years, he has also worked as a teacher, preparing the next generation of musicians and writers. Let's give a warm Bloomington welcome to Edward Kelsey Moore.
Well, thank you for having me. Can you hear me?
No.
Everybody? I wouldn't want you to miss a single word. Okay. It will be exciting. First, let me thank the Bloomington Public Library for having me here. Like every writer, okay, like every writer I have ever met, libraries are very, very dear to me. In fact, the first clear memory of my entire life was in the Central Branch of the Indianapolis Public Library when I was a kid and I went with my mom to get my very first library card. I come from a family that really valued education and really valued books, but didn't have a lot of money. So having a library card was a really big deal in our house. And also, I was the very spoiled youngest child of 3. And knowing that my older brother and sister had library cards and I didn't was just not something I could tolerate. And in fact, them having anything that I didn't have was something that was very upsetting to me. So getting that library card was, getting that library card was a very, very important thing. And when my mother and I got to the library that day, I learned that in order to get my library card, I had to be able to write my full name unassisted. And I didn't know how to do that. I've been told that that restriction has long gone away, and that kids can do that, can get a library card without being able to write their names. And I'm glad, because that means that modern librarians are spared witnessing the kind of meltdown that they saw that day. I screamed and kicked and fell on the floor. I thoroughly embarrassed my poor mother. And I have to admit, that this was not unusual behavior for me. In addition to being very spoiled, I was a wildly, overly dramatic little boy. And I confess that I'm still sometimes given to being overly dramatic. But fortunately, I've settled into 2 careers that reward that, so it all works out. Well, you know, instead of dragging me out of the library after my tantrum, my dear patient mother calmed me down and took me to the reading room of the library. And that library is a beautiful old library. And it was built during an Egyptian art craze, so the bookshelves have sphinxes on them and cats' heads, and it's beautiful. And I remember sitting in that room, and there at the opposite ends of the room there are these giant fireplaces. It looks like the set of the 10 Commandments. And I sat there with my mother, and even though I didn't know how to write my name, I didn't know my letters. So my mother sat there and taught me to write my name so that I could get my library card that day. And I got my library card, and I have not been without one since. And that day was the beginning of the very circuitous route that brought me here. I wouldn't be a reader at all, much less a writer, if it weren't the libraries and the librarians who led me to great books. This is just my very long-winded way of saying that I am really honored to be in a place that opens doors and that is the first step for incredible adventures for young people and for older people and for overly dramatic people and for anybody who wants to learn and experience the world. And again, thank you so much for having me here. I think I'll start by reading just a brief section of The Supremes of Earl's All You Can Eat. This is from chapter 2, and it begins with the sentence of dialogue that begins the movie adaptation of the book. And it's a section that tells us who our main character, Odette, is. I was born in a sycamore tree. That was 55 years ago, and it made me a bit of a local celebrity. My celebrity status was brief, though. 2 baby girls, later my best friends, came along within months of me in ways that made my sycamore tree entrance seem less astonishing. I only mention the tree because I have been told all of my life that it explains how I ended up the way I am. Brave and strong according to those who like me, mannish and pig-headed to those who don't. Also, it probably explains why, after the initial jolt passed, I wasn't much troubled when my dead mother showed up for a chat. I started out life in that sycamore because my mother went to see a witch. Mama was smart and tough. She worked hard every day of her life, right up until she dropped dead in the middle of, from a stroke while she was winding up to throw a rock at a squirrel that was digging up bulbs in her showplace of a garden. All of Mama's toughness evaporated, though, when she found herself halfway through the 10th month of her pregnancy, wondering if it would ever end. 7 years earlier, Rudy had been born right on schedule, but 3 lost babies followed my brother, none of them managing to remain inside my mother's womb for longer than a few months. Now I had come along and refused to leave. Before she went to see the witch, Mama tried all kinds of things her country relatives told her to do to get the baby to come. My grandmother advised her to eat hot peppers with every meal, claiming the heat would drive the baby out. Mama did it for 3 days and ended up with indigestion so severe she was fooled twice into thinking she was in labor. 2 times She and Daddy went to the colored hospital in Evansville, and both times she came home with no baby. My mother's sister whispered to her that the only way to get the baby out was to have sex. Aunt Marjorie said, "That's how it got there, Dora. That's the only sure way to get it out." Mama liked the sex idea, if only just to pass the time while waiting, but Daddy was less than enthusiastic. She was twice his weight even before her pregnancy, and when she straddled him in his sleep one night demanding satisfaction, the terrified look in his eyes as she hovered over him made her back down from the sex solution and look to sorcery instead. Like I said, that was 1950, and back then, a fair number of people in Plainview, black and white, consulted a witch from time to time. Some still do, but nowadays it's only the poorest and most superstitious of folks, mostly the ones who live in the little Appalachian clusters outside of town who will admit to it. Mama went to the witch expecting a potion or a poultice. Poultices were big among witches. But what she got instead were instructions. The witch told her that if she climbed up into the branches of a sycamore tree and straight up knew and sang her favorite hymn, the baby would come. Witches were like that. They almost always mixed in a touch of something approved by the Baptist church, a prayer, a spiritual, or the godlessness of Lutherans. So people could go to see a witch and not have to worry that they'd pay for it down the line with their immortal souls. It absolved the client's guilt, and it kept the preachers off the witches' backs. So, on a windy afternoon, my mother hauled a rickety old ladder out to a sycamore tree by the woods behind the house. Mama propped her ladder up to the tree and climbed up. Then she nestled herself in the crook of two branches as comfortably as was possible considering her condition, and began to sing. Mama used to joke that if she had chosen something more sedate, something along the lines of Mary Don't You Weep or Calvary, she might not have given birth to such a peculiar daughter. But she dug her teeth into Jesus as a rock and swayed and kicked her feet with that good gospel spirit until she knocked over the ladder and couldn't get back down. I was born at 1 o'clock and spent the rest of the afternoon in the sycamore tree until my father rescued us when he got home from his shop at 6. They named me Odette Breeze Jackson in honor of my being born in the open air. As it often happened when a child was old folks who claimed that they knew the wisdom of the ancestors often felt called upon to issue dire warnings. My grandma led the chorus in forecasting a dreary future for me. The way she explained it, if a baby was born off the ground, that child was born without its first natural fear, the fear of falling. That set off a horrible chain reaction, resulting in the child being cursed with a life of fearlessness. She said a fearless boy had some hope of growing up to be a hero, but a fearless girl would more than likely be a reckless fool. My mother also accepted this as fact, although she leaned more toward the notion that I might become a hero. It should be remembered, of course, that Mama was a grown woman who thought that climbing a tree in the 10th month of her pregnancy was a good idea. Her judgment had to be looked on with suspicion. Nearly everybody, it seemed to me, believed that coming into the world in any way that could be seen as out of ordinary was a bad omen. People never said, "Congratulations on managing to deliver a healthy baby while you were stuck in that rowboat in the middle of the lake, they just shook their heads and whispered to each other that the child would surely drown one day. No one ever said, "Aren't you a brave little thing, having your baby all alone in a chicken coop?" They just said that the child would turn out to have bird shit for brains, and then went on to treat the child that way, even if the kid was clearly a tiny genius. Like the doomed child born on the water, and the dummy arriving among fowl, I was born in a sycamore tree, and would never have the good sense to know where to run scared. So, if I were writing the story of my life, the next chapter after my library meltdown when I was a little kid would be about how I became an adolescent novelist, and a few chapters do some very artful suffering, and then I would triumph over adversity by publishing a masterpiece at 22. That is not what happened. Instead, a few years after throwing that tantrum, I began to play the cello. And I fell in love with music. And I didn't circle back to writing for 3 or 4 decades. So it was a long journey from being a book lover to being a novelist. And I thought that this evening I would talk about that journey and talk about the Supremes books and what brought me here. I'll try to be as truthful as possible. Although I've already told one lie. It's not exactly true that I didn't write for decades. I continued to write throughout my musical education and throughout my cello career. What I didn't do was finish anything that I wrote. I have at home a huge Tupperware tub in the basement. And in that tub are hundreds of essays and short stories that I started and never finished. For decades, I would get wonderful ideas and I would sit down all full of excitement and I would work really, really hard and then I'd get distracted. I'd have to prepare a concert or one of my students would need some extra help or there'd be an Addams Family marathon on TV, you know? But whatever happened, I would be drawn away from it and I just wouldn't finish. And I would put those projects aside and fully intending to go back to them. But they always ended up in that tub. And then I turned 40. And I decided that I couldn't stand repeating that pattern anymore. And I couldn't carry that into middle age with me. So I set a goal for myself of finishing one short story. And I thought that that would get the writing bug out of my system. And there was a show on Chicago Public Radio called Stories on Stage. And they used to have an annual, and as it happened, the show was accepting submissions for that contest right then. So, and I loved the show, so I thought, well, this is perfect. I promised myself that I would finish a story and send it off to that contest. I started writing a short story based on my close relationship with my great aunt Aretha. Auntie is what we called her. And she was the best storyteller I've ever known. She was hilariously funny and just smart as she could be. And just as a side note, I also learned later in life that she was illiterate. But she was a brilliant woman who just, unfortunately, was never given an education. But she was just as smart as she could be and so attuned to other people. And I just adored her, and I spent a lot of time with her when I was a kid. In addition to being a wonderful person, was a funeral connoisseur. And her hobby was traveling all over Indianapolis to attend funeral services for anybody she had even the slightest connection to. And the only, since writing that story several years ago, I have met so many people who walk into this, oh, my mother's just like that. so it's not an unusual thing. But the only thing Auntie loved more than a well-executed funeral service was issuing scathing critiques of the services that didn't meet her standards. She would say horrible things about the flowers, about the quality of the grieving, about the outfit on the deceased. Nothing escaped her eye. And I turned my memories of Auntie into a short story called Grandma and the Elusive Fifth Crucifix. And I got really, really excited about that story. I worked very, very hard on it. But when the deadline came for mailing that story into the radio station, that story went unfinished into the Tupperware tub with all the others. And my writing career might have languished in that Tupperware tub if my music career hadn't collided with it. When I was hired to play a string quartet gig at a theater in downtown Chicago. Now, as some of you might know, classical musicians often don't know what we're going to play or for whom we're going to play until we get to the gig. We are told when to be there and what to wear. Well, when I got to this job, I discovered that I'd been hired by Chicago Public Radio, and that the event was a celebration for the winners of that short story that I had not managed to enter. That night, I spent 3 hours playing Mozart quartets and kicking myself. Well, I remember it as 3 hours. It was probably more like an hour and a half, but it felt like 3 hours. And it wasn't even that I thought I was going to win it. It was that I'd fallen back into that same pattern after promising myself that I wouldn't. And that evening, as I played quartets, I made a new promise, and I told myself I would never let myself feel this awful again. And the first thing I did was go back to the library, and in Chicago this time, and I checked out a new set of short stories every week and read countless books. And I read a bunch of books about how to write a short story. Because it also occurred to me that maybe part of the problem is I didn't know how to write. So I read a lot of books about writing, and after logging in many, many hours in my neighborhood library, when that same contest came around again the next year, I fished that short story about the funeral of an old lady and her grandmother. And that story ended up winning the short story and it began my writing career. A very well-known agent in New York ran across, not the agent who represents me now, but another agent ran across the grandma story in a small literary magazine and wrote a letter to me asking to see the rest of my short story collection. Yeah. I wrote him back and I said, I'd send it to him just as soon as I polished a few more stories. And I did not mention that one story was the extent of my literary output. Over the next year, I wrote a short story collection. And eventually, several of those stories were published in different magazines. The collection itself has never been published as a collection. But when I sent to this agent, he wrote me a very nice letter back and said, "Oh, that's very nice, but nobody wants a short story collection from an unknown author. So write a novel." And very naively, I said, okay. And I began The Supremes of Earl's All You Can Eat. And when I wrote The Supremes of Earl's All You Can Eat, I returned to my family for inspiration. As a kid, I figured out pretty early that the conversation happening in the room after, with my mother and the other women in the family, the conversation that happened after they cleared the table after big family meals was much more interesting than the conversation in the room where my dad and the other men were watching sports. And so I just started hanging out outside. They wouldn't let me in the room, but I would just hang out outside the room and listen in because it was fascinating. And I would, from my position parked outside the room, I listened to the stories that the women were telling each other. And even when I was too young to fully understand the sometimes very adult subject matter, I still was struck by how quickly the topics veered from heartbreakingly tragic to wildly hilarious. And I was amazed also that the women who had the hardest and saddest lives were usually the funniest people in the room. And that made a big impression on me, and I think you can see that in my writing. I didn't spill any family secrets or tell any family stories in my novels, but I did use the rhythm and the character and the spirit of those conversations that I eavesdropped on, and when I created The Supremes. I did use one family story in The Supremes of Earl's All You Can Eat. And that's something that happens very early in the novel. And that's a story of my great aunt Edith, whose husband died beside the bed one night before going to bed while he was saying his prayers. And just like many in the novel, Aunt Edith didn't tell anybody until the next morning because she wanted to get a good night's sleep. I had loved that story since I was a little kid. And so I thought, well, I'll just put that in the book because it's a lot of fun. And I wrote it pretty much as I remembered it from my childhood. And later, my mother told me, that never happened. She says, you made that up, that never happened. And not only that, Aunt Edith's husband outlived her. Even when I try to write the truth, it comes out fiction. So it's only a half. Anyway, so if you've read either of my novels, or run across any of my short stories or essays, you'll recognize some familiar themes that run through my work. I'm definitely a writer who returns to the same subjects in his writing. Grandma and the Elusive Fifth Crucifix, my very first short story, was about a Baptist grandmother who drags her beloved grandson to funerals. It's about love, family, and religion, and death. The Supremes of Earl's All You Can Eat and its sequel are about different kinds of love, love between friends and family members and spouses, also about religion. Each of the main characters attends a different church, and it very much influences the women that they grow up to be. And it's about death. Death is a recurrent occasion, let's call it that, in all of my books. And I love writing about families, and the workings of families are endlessly fascinating to me. Every family is different, and I really love examining the ways that different families deal with the challenges that come their way. Are they supportive of one another? or do they self-destruct? Are they kind or are they unkind? Do they become stronger? Do they fall apart completely? And there are so many possibilities that I love sorting through them on the page. I didn't base any of the characters in my books on my relatives, but many of my relatives have told me that they recognize themselves in the books. I cannot even count the number of women in my family who have told me that they thought likely they were the inspiration for Barbara Jean, the most beautiful woman in town. They were not the inspiration. But I just nod and say, oh, okay. And without fail, when people have suggested that maybe they were the inspiration for it, it has never been a character that I would have ever thought they would have seen themselves in. But it's been interesting, you know, that's how books are. You know, when there's a quote, books are a mirror. And, you know, so how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us, we find that in the books that we read. And it's been interesting to see when people tell me what they see in my books. It's vastly different often from what I see. And it's no less legitimate, but it's really fascinating to me. You know, I should say, on the other end of the spectrum, I had a very interesting experience during a reading long after Best of Dreams and Earl's All You Can Eat had been published. I was reading a section of the book, and it occurred to me just that Big Earl was my father. I was reading from the novel, and it just hit me. Every word that comes out of Big Earl's mouth could have been said by my father. Every word that some other character attributes to him could have been said by my father. It was never in my mind when I wrote it. And not coincidentally, my father became ill and passed away not that long after the book came out. And so, of course, he was on my mind as I was writing the book. But it was not something that I was conscious of. But now, when I look at the book, it is complete, it's right there. And, you know, over the years, I've always known that the book was about friendship, that the book was about how friendship can continue throughout a life and even after a life. And over the years, though, I've also come to see that Big Earl's kindness and wisdom are really central to the novel. And because his acts of kindness, very casual acts of kindness, reverberate through generations. And it's something that I see more now than I saw when I first wrote the book. And it's a very satisfying thing for me to see my dad in the book, and my mother's a storyteller, and she's also all over this book. I think my parents, the two of them, are probably the reason that I write so much about romantic love. I was very lucky that I grew up with parents who loved each other. And at the time, of course, I didn't appreciate that was a big deal. I thought everybody's parents adored each other, and that everybody's parents treated each other with kindness and respect and never raised their voices to each other. It was a shock to me to learn that there were people who didn't get along. But, you know, and that's, I look back at that and I think, oh, wow, what an incredible gift that was for me. And, you know, my mother and father met when they were 3 years old.
Wow.
And They were together from their teenage years until my father died in his 80s. And when you see and live with a great love affair, it makes an impression on you. And I write a lot about people who love one another. And the characters in my novel, in both of my novels, they expect love. Even the ones who don't deserve it expect love. And the only characters who don't expect love are characters who have been traumatized. And then that's something else to explore on the page. You know, how does someone get to the point in their life where they don't expect love? And it's a fascinating thing for me, and I know that that is something that comes from my upbringing. And so, again, something I'm very, very thankful for. I write a lot about death. And that's mostly because I was raised by very religious parents in a Baptist home. My parents first started talking to me about my eventual death and preparing me for it when I was about 4 years old. Wow. And it was kind of like, you know, have a nice day at school, and remember, we're all gonna die. That's just how it was. And so death pops up in my thoughts and in my writing at these kind of odd moments that I think sums up just how deeply ingrained in my thoughts that death is. It's the story of the day that my editor called me to tell me that the Supremes and Earls All You Can Eat was going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. When my editor told me the news, I went silent for several seconds. And she said, "Ed, are you still here? What are you thinking?" And I told her I wasn't thinking anything. I told her I was just too thrilled and too overwhelmed to think, that I was just stunned into silence. That was a lie. Because I had been preparing for my death since I was a toddler, when I learned that my novel was going to be on the New York Times bestseller list, my very first thought was, oh my God, my obituary is going to be so good. I was picturing it. I could see New York Times bestselling author Edward Kelsey Moore dies. And I was just thrilled. So, writing about religion also becomes very natural to me. My dad was a preacher, and I don't really think of myself as a preacher's son because my father didn't become a preacher until I was a teenager. But the family was very, very religious throughout my life. And I spent a lot of time in church. And I loved it. Mostly, I gotta say, I loved the theatricality of church. I loved the preacher, just singing and moaning and, dancing and moving. I loved that. And I remember my brother and I would always be so excited if we sat next or near this very particular woman, this older woman who would get the Holy Ghost and jump onto the back of the pew and walk like a tightrope. And it was so exciting. We were just, and I remember the beautiful hats that the women used to wear and the wonderful outfits that they wore. I loved all of that, the pageantry of church. I look back on that and I think that it just made such a powerful, powerful impression on me. And my parents, I think, would have rather I'd been more impressed with the sermon, but I still loved being there. And the messages of the sermons didn't completely escape me. In fact, again, it pops up here and there, and again in my novels, and in other things that I write, it pops up. There was an experience I had a few years ago that really made me see this more clearly. A few years ago, a woman wrote me from Paris, and she had read the French translation of my first book. And she wrote me after there had been a terrorist attack in Paris. And she wrote me and told me that reading The Supremes was helping her get through her grief and shock. And I wrote back to her and I thanked her for writing, and I typed the very first thing that came to mind. And to my surprise, what I typed was from Psalms. And I said, "Weeping may endure through the night, but joy comes in the morning." And it was the very first thing I thought, and it's something I believe. And I was like, wow, I guess I'm still a Baptist. And I guess I'm still a preacher's son. And I think, again, if you look at my writing, you kind of go, maybe this is a preacher's son. It leaps out when I least expect it. And music is the same way for me. I've been a musician for more than half a century. And music is enmeshed in every aspect of my life. It's a part of everything I do. A classical pianist is one of the main characters of both my novels. And a blues man is the main character of the sequel to The Supremes and Earl's All You Need. And music is just all over my writing, whether I intend it to be or not. I was playing for the Joffrey Ballet when I wrote The Supremes and Earl's All You Need. And I wrote most of that novel in the pit at the Joffrey Ballet. I would write during the breaks, and I would write during the time between the matinee and the evening performance. And I did that because that's when I had time to do it. I had a job. I was teaching, and I had other performances that I had to do, so I was working quite a lot. And those were the times that I was able to write. So I would sit in the ballet and the theater, and I would just write down in the pit when I could. And I didn't realize that it had any effect on my writing until I was at an event much like this, and I was talking to someone about the novel, and we were having a little question and answer thing, and someone asked me how I chose the name of my main character. And I explained that it was a random choice. I said, well, Odette started out, I think the first name for her was Aurora, and then I renamed her Giselle, and then I renamed her Odette. Now, if that person pointed out to me, what some of you who are familiar with ballet have already noticed, those are all names of ballet heroines. Odette is the heroine of Swan Lake. Aurora is the heroine of Sleeping Beauty. Giselle is the heroine of Giselle. And again, it never occurred to me. When I was writing it, it was like, I'm sitting there in the pit after having played Sleeping Beauty, going, well, I think Aurora sounds like a nice name. But it wasn't something that I thought of. It just happened. And that connection between music and writing is something that I depend upon, but I'm not really that aware of it. I will say though, in one instance, I'm very aware of it, and that is on a very technical level. And when I was writing The Supremes, I needed some sort of structure for the book. And I didn't have a literary education, so I depended on the structures that I knew, and those are musical structures. And in particular, what I decided was that each of my main characters would live a symphony movement. And essentially, I won't go, this can get really nerdy, I'll try not to, but essentially, there's a form called sonata form. And the first movement of almost every major symphony is in sonata form. And the basic thing is, you have a theme, and then you have a counter theme, and then you have a conflict between those themes and a mixing together of those themes, and then you resolve that conflict and restate your main theme, and that's the end. And so I'll have each of these main characters be set up like that. They'll have their theme, who they are, something that interferes with that, and stops them from getting where they need to get, and then a resolution. And that was because I knew those forms, and I knew how to write that. And I think that's what writers do. That's what artists of all types do. You use what you got to do what you need to do. And so that's what I've done with my career. I tried to use what I've got. And for me, it has been, the childhood I had, the people I've lived around, the things that I saw around me growing up, and then as an adult, being a musician. I've tried to listen carefully to my characters, to the rhythm of their speech, and try to bring that onto the page, and try to bring that to the reader. The Supremes and Earls drastically changed my life. Became a bestseller, and had a long book tour that allowed me to meet readers across the country and in Europe, and it became a movie and reached an even wider audience. But for me, the proudest moment of my writing career happened before any of the success that other people got to see. I see as the peak of my writing life to this day, and the moment that I try again and again to recapture is the way I felt walking from my front door to the mailbox with that completed short story for the Chicago Public Radio Contest. I remember every step of that walk. And because I knew that something significant had happened to me in that moment. And I was right. That was the first time in my life that I felt like a writer. And that journey has been incredible, to try to recapture that feeling. The life of any writer, the career of any writer, is not a straight line. And there are ups and downs constantly, just like regular life. And the truth is, I will never live long enough to receive the number of acceptances as I've had rejections. But tomorrow, I will go back to work on the novel that I'm writing now, which is about complicated family relationships and long-time friendships and religion and death. And it's not easy to write. And disappointment and rejection are a part of the game and a part of living as an artist. But for me, feeling like a writer and being a writer, make it all worthwhile. Thank you.
There are microphones if you want to get up. I don't know if you can use your outside voice. You can just raise your hand and we can do that. Whatever you're comfortable with.
I have a question. How did you come to choose Mrs. Roosevelt as a lush, as one of your characters?
Well, I'll tell you, there are a couple of reasons. The main reason really is that I love Eleanor Roosevelt. I have tremendous respect for her, and I think she's one of the great Americans of the last century. I really do. Right? Full stop. And she is so quotable. And when I, first draft of the novel, I had a lot of Eleanor Roosevelt quotes in it. Ultimately, they went away, but she was just an incredible woman. And then over time, when I decided to change things and focus a little bit more on Odette, a lot of things went away. But then I thought, in a novel about friendship, I wanted Dora, Odette's deceased mother, to have a friend. And I thought, and when it became clear to me that I wanted that friend to have very little dialogue. I think she has 2 lines of dialogue in the entire book. And I thought, well, who is someone who has enough presence and substance to not need words? And I thought, oh, Eleanor Roosevelt. So, and that's why Eleanor Roosevelt. Also, it was just a lot of fun. She, the Eleanor Roosevelt in the novel, of course, is, not very much like the actual Eleanor Roosevelt. But I thought, I wonder if maybe, with what I read about Eleanor Roosevelt, she might enjoy an afterlife where she just got to do whatever she wanted to do. And just, be ridiculous and drink and fight and do all these wild things. And that's why Eleanor Roosevelt. Yes?
So what was your inspiration to have some poor woman climb a ladder and have a baby in the cemetery?
Well, that really was, I thought, well, I'd like to begin this with a fairy tale. And I thought, well, I'd like there to be this element of magic that runs through the book. And I wanted to give her a bit of a magical birth and a magical entrance into her. And that notion that there's a cause for her fearlessness, and that this cause is this sort of magical thing. And that was it. I thought, oh, what's a nice way of having that? Oh, yeah, she's born in the situation. I like that. Yes?
I've read quite a few books lately where they start the book with a playlist and might even match it chapter for chapter with a song. What would be some on your playlist for this book?
Oh, gosh. I did actually want to write a playlist, didn't I? I don't know what became of it. But this is just shows my age. I love a lot of early R&B, and there's a lot of early R&B, and when I write, I listen to folk music. actually. It's a mellow, and it puts me in the right place to write. But as a soundtrack for this book, I think this is a book that is definitely $60 reading. I wish I could be more specific. Yes?
Hi, I am also a PK kid.
Okay.
And have you thought about writing about the stories about your dad's church, some of the members and things that you grew up
I
seeing?
have. Yes.
Especially a Pentecostal church.
It
We've
was-
seen people jump over pews and
Yes.
things like that.
It's interesting, because every now and then I'll talk to people about church and about the church that I grew up in. I was a missionary Baptist church, they're an old school missionary Baptist church. And it was so natural with me, and I saw it every weekend, that I don't think of it as unusual. It's only when I talk to my friends that they're like, Holy Ghost. So it's funny, I often think, well, why would anybody want to read about that? Everybody knows about that. But then I go, oh, I guess not. So yeah, I do think about it every now and then, but I tend to then fall back into that habit of thinking, oh, everybody knows about this, and this is not unusual. But one of these days, right, there are stories. There are lots of stories. I've got to wait for a few more people to die. Yes.
Well, speaking of death, and you mentioned your obituary and being a New York Times bestseller. What has yet to be that you also would like in your obituary? We have New York Times bestseller Edward Kelsey Moore, but now what is that thing you think that isn't there yet you would hope to achieve?
Well, I think the dance career is right around the corner. I can't imagine anything else. No, honestly, I want to write more, and I want to, this is not a fun answer, but frankly, but as I get older, I think about what are the things that I want to give to the world, and frankly, what I'm thinking about now are how I can be more useful to the world around. I think we have enough, and I used to think, well, I'm not being a jerk, and I think I could do more than not be a jerk. So maybe that's what I'll in the obituary. It was not a jerk. Often. But, yes?
What made you choose Chopin as the primary musician that Clarice loved?
Well, Chopin is I think just a pianist composer, and she is a virtuoso, and Chopin was a virtuoso. I thought that would be the composer that she would feel most connected to. And there's also, in the next book, she plays a lot of Beethoven. There's another virtuoso pianist, another big piano. So it's more just about these composers that I thought would speak to humanists. Yes?
What was the process of getting the book published? Once you wrote it, was it that same agent then that took it, or what happened?
No, that agent rejected the book immediately, but very politely. They were all very polite. All the Sometimes it's true. In the music world, the rejections are not polite. People are very blunt, and they let you know why they reject you immediately. And let me rephrase that. If they respect you enough, they let you know why. They usually don't bother letting you know why. They just let you know you aren't it. And so it's very blunt and in your face, and it's not nicely done. And I was used to that. And then when I started writing and started getting rejections, a lot of times I wasn't even sure I was being rejected. Because I was like, well, this is very nice. You know, they say, so it's been most of the rejections saying lovely things about your writing. And then you're thinking, well, are they going to publish it or not? But then you realize, okay, they're saying from the very first sentence, no, but they're just saying it in the nicest way. So, so that agent wrote me a very lovely letter and said no in the nicest way possible. And there were several other agents who declined to represent the book. And then one agent was recommended by a friend, and he read it and he loved it. And he said, I absolutely love this book. He made a couple suggestions for things he wanted me to change, and I did. And the book then went out to publishers, and I think I had 1 week, I think, 1.5 weeks, 2 weeks. 2 weeks before I had the author from Knopf, the publisher of the first book. So it all happened quite quickly, and I was very, very happy. I loved working on that first book with my editor. My editor was a wonderful woman named Carol Barron, who was the editor for May the Benchy and for no, or maybe what was the main one? Are you there, God? Judy Bloom. Thank you. And Judy Bloom. And so I had a wonderful editor who edited fabulous books, and it was a really great experience. And the editor of my second book was also a fine editor. So I've been able to be around in a company of great people, and it's been a lot of fun. Yes.
How do you balance your love and giftedness for music and your love and giftedness for writing?
Well, there is no balance. I used to have a long answer to that question because I thought I was balancing things. But now I realize, no, there is no balance. I am lurching madly between the two things and trying to do as good a job as I can at both things. I recognize that I'm so fortunate to be able to do two things that I love. Most people don't get one. And I've been able to do two. So, and I'm also aware, as I get older, that there is a time limit, especially for musicians. The things that I could do physically as a young player, I can't do anymore. And it's unfortunate, but it's the truth. And that's the way time works, unfortunately. But, and while I can, I want to play as much and as well as I can. And that's, I think, what I have to do, to just go to every opportunity as joyfully as I can, and with my arms as widely open as I can. Yeah. Yes.
So when you're not lurching, what do you do for free time if you get some?
Oh, I drink. I'm a writer. I do some heavy literary drinking. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm not a fanatic. I'm kidding. But I'm telling you honestly, I don't have a lot of free time, but I'm lucky to live in an area, you know, I live in Chicago, but I'm lucky to live on the edge of the city and able to take beautiful walks in the woods from home. And I love to cook, and so I'm able to do a lot of those things. And I'm fortunate to be able to hang out with my friends. So that's kind of stuff I like to do. I'm kind of a homebody. Yes.
Your process of writing, do you have the end in mind as you're going through writing the book, or just develop it as you go?
I have an end in mind when I write. I tried, you know, I keep saying about my 2 novels. I have actually written 4 novels. The very first one, I wrote a novel before the Supremes that I don't talk about. And it was genuinely awful. And I didn't really finish it, but it was a murder mystery set at an orchestra, and I will tell you that the harpist did it. With the harp and an arrow. Yeah, it was that good. And so there was that, and then I wrote a book that went not the way I hoped, just after the second Supremes book. And but you know, it was not wasted. It will see like this in another form. But what I try to do is when I'm writing well, is write a good outline and write to that outline, but be willing to move things around and to be flexible with that outline. The third book, the one that didn't quite work out the way I wanted and took much longer, well, I didn't have an end in mind. And I thought, oh, I'll write it just the other. And I realized I'm not an author who can do that. I need to at least think I know what the end is. And then I can change my mind. But I have to think I know what the end is. Yeah. Oh, yes.
What kind of books do you like to read, and do you have any favorite authors?
Oh gosh, my favorite author changes frequently, but because I had the luxury of not having a literary education, I don't differentiate a lot between highbrow and lowbrow, frankly. And I read books that I find interesting, and I read books that I find entertaining. I love Toni Morrison. My favorite book is Beloved. But at the same time, the book that I reread most often is Sula, which, you know, it's just because, you know, it's short, and every single word of Sula is in the right. I just think, wow, it's just this brilliantly concise book. And I think of all of her novels, it is the one with not a single wasted word, and I love that. I love Percival Everett also. Erasure, I think, is a masterpiece. I just love that book. And I love Barbara Kingsolver. I read every book of hers, and I loved Demon Copperhead. I thought it was so wonderful. So just a fabulous book. And it's, you know, and not only do I love her writing, one of the writers that I loved from my childhood was Dickens. So, you know, you got Dickens and Barbara Kingsolver meeting in Demon Copperhead. It was perfect for me. I also love Anne Patchett. And also one of my favorite books is 3 Junes by Julia Glass. I think that's another just modern masterpiece of order. Yes.
I was wondering, when you won the award, how long did it take you to come to the decision to write the novel and not just put it in the box?
Well, that, I was so naive that I thought, well, I can write one short story. What's a novel but a bunch of stories stuck together? So, the ignorance, can just, it is bliss in that sense, that you can just go, oh, well, I can do that. I didn't really think until I was in the middle of it, well, this is hard, but at the same time, I like writing. I am not someone who, the part of writing that's hard is the part that's external to the actual writing. The business part of it. You're trying to get it to a reader. That part of it is hard. The writing part, to me, and let me rephrase that. The writing part is difficult, but it's also fun. And it's also just a really cool thing to do.
Yeah.
Telling stories is a really, really cool thing to do. And I am so aware when I'm sitting down to write that this is a really fortunate position to be in, to be able to sit down and to write. That's a great thing to be able to do. So I love doing that. I'm not one of those people who say, oh, I suffered so with this. I just want to slap people who talk about just how they agonize over it, the difficulty, I don't care. There's some quote about being a writer, it's like opening a vein up to the page of the paper. Somebody knows. Is it Hemingway's?
I think so.
Please. Well, he had a lot more problems than that.
Yeah.
He brings a lot.
But I just think if nobody forces you to write, the world will still turn and be just fine without your writing. And I have very little patience with people who talk about the horrors of the writing life. No, you're very, very fortunate to be able to do that. And if you can get one other person to read your writing, you are one lucky so-and-so. And so for me, when I'm unhappy with the quality of my writing, which is frequent, I try to remind myself of how lucky I am to be able to do it. And that how lucky I am that there might be at least one person, waiting to read something that I wrote. And that's a great thing. Yes?
Can you talk about the experience of having one of your books made into a movie?
Yeah, that's really cool. It's if you're having my book made into a movie, I'm glad that happened. It's just because it's out of your hands, and you have to accept that somebody else is going to take your baby and do whatever they like with it. And I made my peace with that, and I was fortunate. The movie is quite a bit different. If you've seen the movie and read the book, it's quite a bit different. And, but I think they did a lovely job with it. I think it looks great, it's beautifully acted, and I think I was very fortunate to have, especially the director, Tina Mabry, is a great storyteller, and I was really fortunate to have someone who's a great storyteller be in charge of the project. There were just so many cool things about it. I loved going to the set. And I spent a few days down on the set of the movie, and the set for was like they pulled it out of my imagination. It was amazing. And it was so cool. And they were very, very nice to me. And you know, the thing is, I've realized that authors have a bad reputation for making scenes when on the sets of movies, apparently, of their work. And it's kind of a thing. I knew that there was something odd because before it's actually in my contract that they don't have to let me come to the set. And so I talked to a number of people from the movie studio before I went down there, and we had a very pleasant conversation, and I kept thinking, I think I'm being interviewed, you know, I think they're trying to find out if I'm a jerk. And, you know, it's kind of difficult to describe, but, you know, you're getting these questions that are peculiar, and I'm thinking, why is that? And then it's hitting me, oh, they're wondering if I will go down to the set and just start freaking out because they aren't using my words. And it is not a coincidence that the days that I was on the set, almost all the dialogue was directly from the book. But it was a really just a surreal experience. And, you know, to add to this, the composer of the score for the movie, just coincidentally, was at one point the composer in residence for the orchestra that I played with. And so I didn't realize that she was the composer until I went down to the set, and she happened to be there that day. And I was like, wait a minute, this name is... And we had a lovely chat on the set of the movie. And then she wrote a suite of music that was comprised of music from the movie that my orchestra premiered in January. And so I played in the orchestra for the suite that was from the score of the movie. So, and it's just one of those things I'm sitting there going, you know, this is wild. I don't think that any other cellist or any other writer on the face of this earth is having this experience.
I heard about what happened to you when you were trying to get your library card.
Did you hear that? He said they heard about what happened when you were trying to get your library card. Yeah, I had a reputation. Thank you. But yeah, it was a great experience. Yes?
Yes, I just want to tell you, I so enjoyed both your book, particularly your presentation.
Thank you so
And
much.
might I remind you, for your obituary, I'm a retired teacher. Number one, you are a creative teacher, a creative musician, and a creative writer.
I'll write that down. I'm sorry, do I need to?
It's up to you, if there's more questions.
If everybody else has any questions, this could go on for a long time.
All right, okay.
All right. So we did have a drawing for a free book when you came in. You had the option to put your name in a basket for our